there was a cartoon put out by the Department of Energy and Climate Change about 2009, back in Ed Miliband's day, I think, which which sort of showed everybody drowning because we hadn't turned our TV remotes off standby. I mean, it was so completely ridiculous and over the top. And there are children's books like this as well, which I've seen, which sort of show great sort of floods as a result of biblical scale floods as a result of man-made climate change and so on. And if you're brought up on that stuff, well, you probably are going to end up with an exaggerated view of what's happening and a sort of feeling of desperation that governments aren't acting. But of course, it tends to be a indulgence of people who are quite wealthy or
Hmm.
quite well off, I say middle class, who live in comfortable homes. If you've been brought up in a home where your parents have struggled to put food on the table or heat the house, then you're probably going to take a very different line on it.
Well, indeed. Hello, and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. First up, folks, I'd absolutely love it if you could hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell next to it if you enjoy today's content. It helps ensure that you don't miss out on any future videos. And folks, times are hard, but if you're in a fortunate enough position to support Reason's work, ensuring that we can keep our independent voices online, we'd be very thankful indeed. There's a link in the description below. Now, on this week's show, today's guest has a new book out, which I have here. It's called Not Zero, An Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Won't Even Save the Planet. And in a week, folks, in which we've heard that Nissan, with its Sunderland plant here in the northeast, is uncompetitive because, well, the price of energy has gone through the roof, as everyone knows. We know that because many of us are experiencing a very difficult winter in which there is fear around turning the heating on, something as simple as keeping warm. And of course, facing a bill that many simply can't afford. And there's a backdrop as well, folks, of a coal-powered power stations being turned on and off more times than a light bulb to avoid blackouts in Britain in 2023. That strikes me as something seriously, seriously wrong. I think it's an incredibly timely contribution to the debate, this book. It's been backed by Lord Frost and others. I think it's really important, so please do check it out. I'll put a link in the description. I'm delighted to say, of course, that the author of the book and the columnist for a slew of papers, Ross Clark, joins me now. Ross, thank you very much for your time today.
Hello, hi.
Ross, I want to start by asking you about Nissan, that story in particular. Now, I chose Nissan to start, but it could be, a whole load of energy intensive industry. I chose Nissan because it's here in my patch, right? It's an important part of my patch. Many of us know someone employed by the car making plant in Sunderland or around the supply chain near it. Now, they've cited energy bills as one of the reasons why their plant is uncompetitive. Now, I dare say, Ross, you're not surprised at all to hear this kind of rhetoric.
Well, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, UK Steel, for example, has been warning for years that its energy costs are much higher, not just higher than in South Asia, where a lot of steel production now takes place, but also a lot higher than in France or Germany or mainland Europe. And part of the reason for this is carbon levies that we've been putting on dumping on the industry. I mean, we've had an energy policy for several years, which has fixated on the net zero target and has really sort of forgotten issues of affordability and energy security. And I mean, we've heard lots of people say, well, we switched to renewables. If we'd done that faster, we'd be in a much better place now. We wouldn't have been reliant on Putin's gas and so on. But that rather ignores what's happened in such things as the North Sea, where the industries have been wound down. The government sort of happy to see it be wound down, hadn't sort of approved new licenses and so on, because it saw North Sea oil and gas as a twilight industry which we wouldn't need in this glorious green future. The same with fracking. We failed to support UK shale industry, which would have provided sort of home produced gas. And we've invested a lot of money in wind and solar, which, although they're clean and quite cheap in terms simply of generating them, they're intermittent, and you can't just look at the cost of wind and solar energy as itself. I mean, if you're going to have a grid based on intermittent forms of energy, I mean, you need to invest hugely in storage or some other kind of backup, and we just haven't done that.
And weren't we promised, though, Ross, that net zero would be the land of milk and honey, right? We would have a massive explosion in the creation of green industries and jobs. But if Nissan are manufacturing electric cars, there's at least one model I can think of that they're manufacturing at that Sunderland plant. Why wouldn't they want to make them here? Where are these green jobs, this explosion of green jobs? Where are they actually being created?
And in China mostly, that's the world's centre of green jobs. The ONS produces statistics on what it calls the green economy, which shows it just hasn't expanded in Britain in the past decade, in spite of Britain being the first country to commit itself to legally binding net zero emissions by 2050. We were told that was going to create this blizzard of green jobs, and no, it hasn't. It's created a lot of jobs in China,
Hmm.
but not in Britain. And one big reasons for that is the energy bills. We're just discouraging in energy intensive industries in Britain. And it's very perverse, this target, because the net zero target refers only to territorial emissions. That's emissions physically spewed out in Britain. And it ignores emissions elsewhere in the world that are emitted in the course of making goods and food for UK consumers. And what that does, it gives the government this sort of perverse incentive to um, offshore our industry,
Hmm.
offshore our heavy industry, offshore our food production, because our carbon emissions can be offshored with it, and then then appear on somebody else's carbon budget rather than ours.
And that's what it strikes me that this entire movement is about. You've got it's the D of everything, the deindustrialization, the even depopulation, Ross, or degrowth, anti-growth. It's all these things, and it strikes me as a fundamentally anti-human flourishing argument.
It is. There's a very strong sort of anti-human argument among some people on the net zero sort of lobby, if you call it that. But there are two very different sides of it. I mean, a lot of people tell me, "Oh, say the uh, all the politicians are united on net
Yeah.
zero. Why are you questioning them?" But the politicians are not united on net zero. They might be both agree on the target for 2050, but they have hugely different ideas of how we get there. We've got sort of on the left the hair shirt lobby who want to get to net zero by stopping us doing things, flying, driving, eating meat, and so on. But then on the other side, the Conservative government side, we've got this sort of Panglossian approach, which says, "Oh no, no, we don't need to compromise our lifestyles. Technology will ride to the rescue, and it'll all be glorious. Everything will be gloriously cheap in the future." And I say both these schools of thought are off their respective trolleys, because the hair shirt lobby, because they ultimately people are not going to accept to be made poorer in order to reach this arbitrary target. And secondly, the Panglossian school of thought, well, that you can't will technology into existence just because you'd like it to exist. And
Yes.
if we were having this discussion 70 years ago, we'd be talking about nuclear fusion and how it was going to save us. There's a wonderful quote in the book from the chairman of the US Nuclear Association in 1954, who said, it's not too much to expect our children will benefit from electricity which is too cheap to meter. Well, that didn't quite work out, did it?
No.
Similarly, all the sort of technologies that we're being told now will save us and get to a gloriously cheap green future. Well, some may succeed, but an awful lot of them will fail. And but the trouble is, we've got this gun at our head now. We're sort of forced to look for half-baked solutions, simply because we've legally committed ourselves to net zero in the next 27 years.
I wonder, do you feel a sense of anger, or is it frustration, Ross? You don't strike me as a terribly angry man, but it strikes me certainly. I would actually say that it angers me that this was passed by Theresa May in 2019 in a what I deemed at least to be an attempt at creating some form of legacy for herself, because she had an absolutely disastrous premiership. It was passed in 2019 with, barely a vote and certainly not a plan.
No, exactly. I would describe my own feelings as bewildered as to
Mm.
why, um, MPs, for example, who are normally quite robust in questioning whatever the government wants to do, just sort of sat on their hands on this occasion, just nodded the thing through. There wasn't even a proper vote in the Commons. And as you say, the government had no plan how it was going to get to net zero then. It still has no plan how to get to net zero, nor what it will cost. Last 2 years ago, the Treasury was asked to produce a figure for how much it would cost. Refused to do so. So there's too many unknowables, too many technologies haven't been invented or scaled up successfully. Therefore, we can't put a price on it. And yet, all these MPs just didn't even ask the questions. And what I've tried to do in the book really is just sort of try and ask the questions which they should have asked then, but failed to do so.
Indeed, and the book goes through chapter by chapter of all of the points that would be raised or should have been raised back in 2019, Ross. But I wonder, we heard this week, you've sort of already touched on this, but we heard this week that the UK has a new department, a new government department. I rejoice at the thought of new bureaucracy, but the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, I believe it's called. Now, can we really have energy security with the net zero straitjacket placed around our economy, or is it a sensible move because of the arguments that some would make that you raised earlier? Some would say that actually, if only we ditched hydrocarbons sooner, Ross, we'd have been much better off this winter, for example, and wouldn't be experiencing the kind of fears and pressures that we are experiencing right now.
No, well, in many ways, energy security and net zero are at loggerheads with each other, and there they are in the title of this new department. I suppose you could argue that's quite a good thing because it does force us to face up to that. And I mean, net zero is about depriving ourselves of what has been a very cheap form of energy over the past 200 years, which has absolutely transformed lifestyles, transformed life expectancy, from sort of 45 years in 1800 or something. No, we now expect to live to 80 years. I mean, ultimately, that comes down to cheap energy and
Hmm.
provided through fossil fuels. Net zero is about depriving ourselves of those because without a net zero target, there's no reason why we shouldn't invest in renewables if they're cheaper and they're better and they're cleaner. But what all the net zero bit adds to the argument is just, well, we'll deprive ourselves voluntarily of those forms of energy. And of course, the result is it becomes harder to create energy security for particularly as the government seems absolutely determined at the moment that wind and solar are going to be the bedrock of our energy needs in the future. And as I said at the beginning, if you've got intermittent forms of energy, you need some pretty backup or storage or something, and we just don't have that.
Well, on that point, then, a lot of people may be of the view, thinking, well, I plug in my iPhone, right, and it lasts me all day. It has a capability of being charged and a storage facility within it that, powers all day long. Why can we not do that, Ross, with the wind energy and solar energy, or even if we pursue tidal energy, something like that? Why can we not store that cheaply? What's the problem?
Well, I think your phone doesn't use very much electricity
No.
compared to your with your washing machine or your car, or if you have an electric car, that is. But no, here are what's one or two figures. Have come from the Pacific National Laboratory, which looks over the energy across the world, and says that at present to generate wind energy around the world costs an average around $50 per megawatt hour. That's about the same price as gas was
Hmm.
before the spike in gas prices last year. But to store energy in lithium batteries costs around $300 per megawatt hour, 6 times as much as it costs to generate the electricity in the first place. Now, we already have in Britain what we call a capacity market, which is where companies, businesses can bid to provide storage, short-term energy when the wind isn't blowing, the sun's not shining. Um, Now, a few battery installers have won these auctions, and a few handful of these facilities have been built. But mostly those auctions are being won by gas power stations. And so what we're doing at the moment, when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, we turn up the gas and turn down the gas. Not particularly cheap or efficient way of using gas, but it keeps the lights on. We've also cases where these sort of capacity auctions are won by electricity companies, sort of offering to reduce demand when wind and solar power are light. And this is what we had in January: the National Grid handing out bungs to consumers who agreed to turn their dishwashers and ovens off
Hmm.
for a few hours. But you can't you can't fill the enormous hole in intermittent energy supply by that means. So, we already have notionally enough wind turbines and solar panels to meet average UK electricity demand of 37 gigawatts. But on a good day, we manage over half. But on a bad day, and we had many bad days in December when the wind wasn't blowing, the sun wasn't shining, it falls below 2%. Well, you can't, reduce UK energy demand 98% by persuading people to turn off a few ovens. I mean,
Yeah.
you just can't do it. You absolutely need some other kind of more reliable electricity in the grid.
Do you see that as being what will ultimately end up being the solution to this? And I don't propose it as a very nice solution at all, but is that going to be the answer, that actually we have to forego flying unless you're, obscenely wealthy? We have to forego cheap food in supermarkets. We have to forego, of course, foregoing flying means foregoing that one holiday a year for most people. So supermarkets, foregoing driving, Ross, foregoing a whole host of things that we associate with modern life and progress and the fruits of progress that we all enjoy today. Are they going to be precluded for, well, especially the least well off?
Well, if we don't have miracle technological breakthrough in the next 27 years, the answer is yes. I mean, take flying. There's a group of UK scientists called Fires UK who sort of trying to advise the government on many of these issues, and their argument is, their conclusion is that if you're going to meet net zero by 2050, there will be no aviation in Britain, apart from by 2050, we might be able to make short flights by electric planes, but otherwise are saying, the technology is not there to allow it. The government, on the other hand, saying, no, you won't have to give up your holiday. Technology will race to the rescue. Well, they can't both be right, can you? Can they? I
Yeah.
mean, there's a sort of, incredible dissonance between what one group of people is saying, one group of scientists are saying, and what another group of ministers are saying. And it's extraordinary the lack of open debate we really have on this subject. And there are possibilities that we could carry on flying. There's synthetic fuels where you actually make a fuel from sucking carbon dioxide out the air, and generating hydrogen from electrolysis of water, and you can actually manufacture a fuel which behaves very much like aviation fuel and will power a jet. And I mean, that has been tried, but it's very expensive to do that, because you're sort of, you're generating energy and then you're manufacturing a fuel from that energy. There are lots of losses on the way, and it's just hugely expensive. And would your plane ticket, your plane fares will be going up by several orders if we
Well,
switch.
absolutely. And it strikes me that the only thing we're going to achieve with net zero is a net zero amount of all of our bank balances. But Ross, you mentioned debate there, and I think it's a really pertinent point. I made this point this week to Gavin Barwell, who was Theresa May's former chief of staff. I had said that you can't have energy security with net zero. Technology is either wildly expensive or not viable. Now, he replied saying that the depth of ignorance behind my tweet was staggering, and am I being paid to spread disinformation, and if so, by who? Now, suggesting, of course, that I was ignorant, or that I'm potentially being paid to spread disinformation. Ross, I can confirm, sadly, that I'm not being paid, but if BP or Shell are watching, do get in touch. I'm open to talks. Now, on a serious note, do you think this is why so many sceptical, and I'm sure you've had conversations with members of parliament, with members of the media, so on and so forth, business, industry, do you think this is why many people are skeptical of speaking up, speaking out about the net zero ball and chain that's dragging Britain down? Are they just too afraid to speak out and risk the wrath of a powerful lobby and being accused of things like this?
Well, exactly. I mean, this whole issue is sort of shrouded in this a mixture of fear and shame. And I saw a tweet from Kevin Bowen, and I was astounded by it. Well, I was astounded by it because we see it all the time. But
Hmm.
the way in which people like him will just reply in generalities, they'll sort of say, oh, you're making things up without actually saying what you're making up. You're being paid by oil, and like you, I keep being told that I'm in the pay of big oil, and perhaps they tell me where this money is in my bank account, because I can't find it. um and the Sophia angle, the latest thing seems to be to whenever you raise any issue on this, you get to, oh, what will your children think? Your children will think you're stupid or evil. They'll never forgive you, or something. And sort of, all this sort of Stalinist means of sort of appealing to the kids in order to get at the adults. There's a lot of that going on. And yeah, I mean, we sort of, this is one of the net zero. It's just about the law that's been passed in Britain in recent times. So there's no law which has a greater impact on
Yeah.
Britain in the longer term than this. Not even Brexit. Brexit not even nearly as important to the future of this country and the world as the commitment to net zero. And yet we don't have an open debate on it. We've just never had it. We just sort of get shove David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg telling us we're all going to die if we don't do it, and for which there is absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever for these kind of claims. And the sort of net zero side debate, they never address the details, and it's extraordinary the number of times I have raised this issue of energy intermittency from wind and solar, and going to get worse in 2035 because the government says it's going to remove all the gas from the grid. And what do we do then when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, and answer comes to none. There's just nobody in government or in any of these think tanks which back net zero. They've just never answered that. And we had a couple of weeks ago this what was laughably called an independent review of net zero. It was actually conducted by Chris Skidmore, who passed the net zero thing through Commons in the first place. So he's actually sort of marking his own homework. And I read through and thought, well, how is it going to solve this problem of intermittency from wind and solar? And it just said, there was about one sentence said this could be solved through having batteries or hydrogen, storing energy in hydrogen. No attempt to analyze the economics of it, the technological challenges of it, or something. Just said, oh, this may be solved. I mean, it's a problem which is galloping up on us in the next 12 years, and there's just no serious effort to resolve that issue whatsoever.
I had said, it's a bit like appointing Chris Skidmore to lead this review was a bit like asking Attila the Hun, Ross, to put together a review into the downsides of war. It just
Or
strikes me.
asking, or asking Boris Johnson to conduct an independent review of Brexit. I mean,
Yes, yeah, exactly.
exactly the same thing. That would have been laughed out the Commons. But
It would, but they all clap like sort of, I don't know, demented seals or something. It's just so troubling. But I wonder though, can we learn lessons from America? Because you do say that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, right? That carbon dioxide in the atmosphere accumulating, global temperatures rising, and sea levels rising. We don't know what the effect will be ultimately. And carbon emissions aside, fossil fuels are polluting. These are the arguments that you make within the book on what we should actually do. Now, it strikes me that you make comparisons to the United States of America. Now, Ross, I can remember when President Trump was in office and he pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords. And that was met by much hysteria, which I'm sure you'll remember at the time, much hysteria, only for America to then continue on a trajectory of reducing carbon emissions. And actually, if I recall correctly, doing it at that time faster than the EU did. Now, do you put that down solely to fracking? Do you put that down solely to America managing to avoid a sort of net zero noose? What do you put that down to? What can we learn from our American cousins on this issue in particular?
well, firstly, to say the US was reducing its emissions from very much higher levels. So
Yeah.
it's easy to reduce your emissions in percentage terms if you start from very high level. But what happened is that America switched a lot of electricity production from coal to gas, as we have done in Britain. Indeed, and a lot of that was down to fracking, shale gas. It reduced the price of gas, and that kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour electricity generated from gas emits about half as many carbon emissions as that from coal. So, I mean, that is a very good way to reduce emissions. And you look at the Europe, Germany in particular, they're going in the other direction at the moment. They're going back to coal because the dirtiest form of coal too, lignite, because they got their energy policy so wrong, relying on Putin's gas and so on. And but I mean, look, the other sort of aspect of the US. I mean, Trump was sort of eviscerated by the Democrats and by many people around the world for the thing of the Paris Agreement. Biden has been sort of celebrated as a great climate champion because he's not Donald Trump. But I mean, look at what he's done since he's been in office. Has he committed the US to a legally binding target to get to net zero by 2050 or any other date? No. What he's done is pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bizarrely named act, but it's really sort of trying to address the climate through a sort of protectionist lens, if you like. What it does is offer huge bungs to, say, motorists who buy electric cars that are made in America, and to other people who invest in green machinery which is made in America. I mean, it's basically just protectionism in disguise.
Mm.
Biden is trying to support his country's industry, whereas Britain's net zero target is, trying to undermine our own industry, and that's a sort of huge difference, of approach.
What do you see then as the reason? You mentioned young people there. Now, young people would be very much, I think they'd look at a book like this called Not Zero and say, climate denier, or, you want the planet to die. What about my future? I've got visions of Greta Thunberg with her famous "How dare you" speech, where she looks down the barrel of the camera and accuses all of us skeptical of these arguments of doom and gloom and apocalypse and all the rest of it as being swivel-eyed in the money, in the pay of oil and gas. What do you see as the reason, though, Ross, why so many young people, led by, this teenage truant, are willing to actually glue their bums to our roads? They're willing to block emergency services, being able to get to and from emergencies, to attack priceless works of art and face arrest in the name of climate. What explains, in your view, this piety when it comes to the green movement?
Well, I'd say some green young people think that way. I would
Yeah.
never say that all young people think alike any more than middle-aged or old people think alike. But it's a particular class of young people, I would say, sort of middle class, university educated people who have sort of fallen for the just stop oil extinction rebellion sort of way of thinking. And I thought, well, there's two aspects. I think, partly these are anti-capitalists in disguise. If you remember, I mean, well, students have always have had this the sort of anti-capitalist movement. I mean, we've had these demonstrations in Britain for the past 2 decades, but they sort of gained a bit more traction when it was connected to the climate, because of course everybody cares about the environment. But I think there are when you actually listen to what the sort of just stop oil sort of people are saying, how they're speaking, I mean, it seems to me they are sort of genuinely traumatized. They have
Hmm.
convinced themselves that we're all going to die unless we stop burning oil tomorrow. The science does not back that in any way, but I think they have been traumatized partly because of an education which has exaggerated the effect. I mean, there was a cartoon put out by the Department of Energy and Climate Change about 2009, back in Ed Miliband's day, I think, which sort of showed everybody drowning because we hadn't turned our TV remotes off standby. I mean, it was so completely ridiculous and over the top. And there are children's books like this as well, which I've seen, which sort of show great sort of floods as a result of biblical scale floods as a result of man-made climate change and so on. And if you're brought up on that stuff, well, you probably are going to end up with an exaggerated view of what's happening, and a sort of feeling of desperation that governments aren't acting. But of course, it tends to be a indulgence of people who are quite wealthy
Hmm.
or quite well off, I say middle class, who live in comfortable homes. If you've been brought up in a home where your parents have struggled to put food on the table or heat the house, then you're probably going to take a very different line on it.
Well, indeed. And I wonder as well. I mean, I can remember Ross being at school, and you know the film A Day After Tomorrow with Jake Gyllenhaal and others. And I'm sure Al Gore was involved with that somehow, or there was something like that going on. And Al Gore, of course, being a contender for the US presidency, who's a big, big climate fanatic. And this film, we were made to watch it in school, and we were told basically, this is what's going to happen. Now, in that film, Her Majesty the Queen in one scene goes up in a helicopter, and the helicopter freezes. It completely goes stone cold. It stops spinning round. Her Majesty the Queen is lost in a heap of snow on some mountain somewhere. It's just like this narrative of apocalypse, and to teach children that, to tell children. No wonder there are massive swathes of kids these days, Ross, that are experiencing climate nightmares. Nightmares about either burning to death, drowning to death, freezing to death, because kids are being taught this and have been for many years now. I find that quite sick, personally.
Well, no, it's extraordinary. I find that I haven't seen that film. I mean, I know about it, but I wasted my time at the cinema watching it. But I think the extraordinary sort of conceit that the North Pole is going to be ice free. It's going to melt all the ice, so we're going to drown. But at the same time, our latitude at 51 degrees north is going to be deep frozen in the future. It just seems completely bizarre. I mean, ice-free poles, yeah, sort of pack ice and permanent glaciers at 52 north to make any kind of sense whatsoever. But yeah, I mean, that sort of thing used to be called science fiction, and we used to have
Yes.
science fiction when I was at school too. But I mean, it didn't sort of we weren't shown the films in school and told them that is the truth and told that that's the truth. I mean, it was science fiction. It was just sort of nonsense, but entertaining nonsense.
Now, finally, Ross, I wonder if I can ask you to be my Mystic Meg today. Where do you see this all ending up? Where will the government, and it's looking increasingly likely that it won't be a Tory government, but whatever party the government ends up being, will that end up abandoning the net zero target, or are we destined to be both colder and poorer in pursuit of it? I mean, we've even got His Majesty the King, a staunch environmentalist. The Duke of Cambridge, the former Duke of Cambridge, now the Prince of Wales, William, he is a big fanatic on all of this stuff too. Are we destined to stay on this road, to give more backing to China, to Russia, and others, to deindustrialize, to make ourselves poorer? Is this the path for Britain? Should I get on the next plane out to Australia whilst I can still fly, and get over there and say goodbye to this country? Are you more optimistic than that? Or are you, as doom and gloom as perhaps the climate apocalypse lot are?
Well, I think in the immediate future there'll be no change. I can't see the current government or the Keir Starmer Ed Miliband are certainly not going to remove the net zero target. But in the longer term, I think one of three things is going to happen. I mean, firstly, we have multiple miracle breakthroughs on all kind of technological fronts, and we get to net zero without injuring our economy too much. I think that's highly unlikely, but let's not discount it. Um, Secondly, I think that the government will eventually, or a UK government will eventually have to relax this target. The closer we get to 2050, the more likely that's to happen. But the third sort of possibility is the one I really fear, which is that government ploughs ahead with it and tries to fudge it. to get to net zero, boast about it, while meanwhile dismantling the rest of our industry and food production, making us poorer, and generally, you know, fiddling the figures by sort of
Yes.
planting trees everywhere and that sort of thing. And I think that could be absolutely hugely damaging to the UK economy because it's quite clear that other countries, the big emitters, China, US, and so on, they're not going to tie their hands behind their backs in this way. China has a net zero target, but it's an aspiration. It's made it absolutely clear it's not going to sacrifice economic growth to get there. But we do have a target which very much will sacrifice economic growth, and if we plough ahead, regardless to of the realities.
Yeah, yeah. I really hope there is a change, and I really hope actually there's a movement to a new vote leave, perhaps a new sort of mirroring the success story of Euroscepticism. Hopefully, by the way, Ross, it doesn't take 40 odd years for politicians to realise that we're on a path to complete and utter madness. But until then, we've got your fantastic book here, Ross, where people can actually get clued up on this stuff because, as you say, it reaches in to every area of public policy. It really, really is that pertinent an issue. But Ross Clark, thank you very much for your time. And again, I say Net Zero out now, well worth your time. So please do go out and get it. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Darren.
Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.